Well, hello everyone. My name's David Stevenson. I'm a professor in the International History Department at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the area that I specialise in is European and global politics in the era of the First World War. And I'm going to be giving a series of mini lectures on that subject for MASSOLIT. And I'm going to start off, we're going to work, if you like, through it in chronological order. So we're going to look at the outbreak of the war, the middle of the war, and then the aftermath and the conclusion, particularly looking at the League of Nations. But what I want to start with is the reasons for the outbreak of the First World War. This, of course, has been a subject of enormous controversy now for over a century. What I want to focus on really is the role of Germany in the outbreak of war. So I'll look at that first of all, which is where the argument is mainly centred on, and then, having looked at the role of Germany, I'll then look at the role of other countries, including Britain, the UK. So I can just start off. There's been a cycle of controversy which has really gone through two complete phases, and it's kind of repeated itself, but it's important to understand that background before I give you my personal view on who was responsible for the outbreak of the war. The thing to start off with is to go back to the Treaty of Versailles, the peace treaty signed in 1919 at the end of the war. Article 231 of that treaty directly bears on this theme. It's the topic. That article is called the War Guilt Clause, and in Article 231, the victorious countries, including Britain and America and France, set the argument that the responsibility for the outbreak of the war lay with aggression, calculated aggression, premeditated aggression even by Germany and its partners. So on that basis they justified claiming reparations and damages from Germany for the chaos and damage and loss that had been caused. So the War Guilt Clause is the starting point. That was terribly controversial right through the 1920s and 1930s. It wasn't just a historical question, it was a judicial and political question. The government of the Weimar Republic in Germany waged a very successful campaign against Article 231 and what the Germans called the war guilt lie. By the 1930s and 1940s, many British and American historians had accepted a lot of the arguments the Germans were putting, that the war was not a result of German aggression. It was everybody had a kind of shared responsibility for the outbreak of the First World War. By the time you get to the 1950s and 1960s, historians like A.J.P. Taylor in Britain were arguing that the whole thing was essentially a result of miscalculation, a tremendous mistake. Either nobody was responsible or everybody was responsible. So that's the first phase of the cycle. And the second phase of the cycle begins with another famous historian. This is a German historian, Professor Fritz Fischer, who wrote two enormous and very influential books in the 1960s. But the first one, which is called in German Griff nach der Weltmacht, or Grasp for World Power, as its title suggests, argues once again that Germany was primarily responsible for the First World War. He wrote a second book called War of Illusions, arguing even more strongly that the German leaders had pre-planned the outbreak of the war since 1912. This thesis became very influential in Germany, and the Germans were particularly susceptible to the idea that they, surprisingly perhaps, but very susceptible to the idea that Germany had been mainly responsible for the First World War and actually also for the Second World War. Fischer's theses were accepted quite a lot in the Western countries as well. So by the time you get to the 1980s and 1990s, a sort of modified view that Germany was primarily responsible for the outbreak of the war had achieved a great deal of acceptance. Most recently, with the centenary of the First World War, we've seen a swing back, once again the cycle coming back to starting point. The most influential of a series of new books has been a book by Chris Clark called The Sleepwalkers, which has been a tremendous bestseller in Germany itself, and this is going back to, if you like, to something closer to the old A.J.P. Taylor view, that it was not primarily Germany's responsibility, it was everybody's or nobody's responsibility. So that's the debate. That's roughly where we are now with the debate. Now, what I want to do is to come back to what the German government actually did in July, August 1914, in the crisis that led to the outbreak of war. Let's go back to the actual events. I want to highlight four things that the Germans did. I'm not going to say that there were no mitigating circumstances. I'll come back to that. Let's just look at what the German government actually decided to do. The first thing that it did was to give something called the blank check. This is a key starting point because it's vital in the story of how what began as a crisis in the Balkans in southeastern Europe escalated to involve the two big alliance blocs in Europe. That's Germany and Austria on the one hand, the so-called Central Powers. On the other hand, there's a clash between them and Britain, France and Russia, the so-called Triple Entente. Now a key stepping stone, if you like, in the story of this escalation is the giving of the blank cheque. This is on the 5th and 6th of July 1914. The immediate context to it had been a famous episode, the assassinations on the 28th of June at Sarajevo of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, that's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. They were assassinated by a Serbian South Slav nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, who was helped by agents in Serb military intelligence, as were his other conspirators. So a nationalist outrage. The First World War actually begins and develops from a terrorist outbreak down in the Balkans, assassination of the heir to the throne and his wife of Austria-Hungary, which is the chief ally of Germany. So one of the two big power blocks in Europe. The Austrians responded to this by asking the German government for assistance. And the German government response to the mission that arrives from Austria-Hungary is to deliver the so-called blank cheque. The German Emperor and the German Chancellor encourage the Austrians to use force against Serbia and promise Germany will be backing them whatever happens. So that's point one, that is secret, that is the so-called blank cheque. What happens then is the Austrian government, after a period of delay, sends an ultimatum to Serbia which is designed to be unacceptable. That's the 23rd of July. The Serbian government accepts 90% of it, but not everything, and therefore the Austrian government feels it has sufficient justification to declare war on Serbia, which it does on the 28th of July. So that's the first thing, the blank cheque leading to a war in the Balkans. The second thing is, when the Germans gave the blank cheque, they not only accepted that this might cause a war in the Balkans, which they wanted, but they knew that there was a risk that it would lead to a general European war, particularly if Russia came to the assistance of Serbia, fellow Slav country, against Austrian attack. This is in fact what happened. From the 26th of July onwards, the Russians were starting military measures, getting their armed forces ready, and once this happened, the Germans then took, if you like, escalated the crisis a stage further by warning Russia to stop its military measures and warning Russia's ally, that's France, that if Russia came into the First World War, the German government demanding that if Germany and Russia go to war, that France should stay neutral. The Russians don't stop their military measures, the French don't pledge to stay neutral, and Germany then sends further warnings before declaring war on both those countries. So point one then was the blank cheque. Germany wants a local war in the Balkans. Point two, Germany deliberately risks a general European war. And when France and Russia intervene, the Germans go on to declare a European war. Now the final thing to be said about German share of responsibility for the crisis is that the German war plan, which is often called the Schlieffen Plan, the Germans expect that if a war breaks out, it will be a war on two fronts, and their plan for winning that is to attack France first before turning back against Russia. And the Germans follow through on this after they've declared war. They invade, and the way they expect to defeat France quickly is by going round the French fortifications on the frontier, by invading Belgium. This, they know, is highly likely to bring in Britain, and it does in fact do so. So that's the final stage of the German share of actions and their responsibility in the crisis. So the Germans do all these things. Now the question is whether there are mitigating circumstances, whether we move away from Germany to look at the other side of the equation. First thing, there is a share, the Germans don't do the assassinations at Sarajevo. Fritz Fischer, who I mentioned before, used to argue that before he died, he argued that the Germans had premeditated a European war since 1912. Hardly anybody has accepted that view. So I think most historians would now argue that the First World War would not necessarily have happened in 1914 had it not been for the assassination at Sarajevo. So this means one share of the responsibility goes with the Serb nationalists who did that assassination. Christopher Clark, in his book called The Sleepwalkers, even describes Serbia as a rogue state. This hasn't gone down well in Serbia, but his argument is that the Serbian military intelligence was out of control and was responsible for this terrorist outrage. So there's a share of responsibility, if you like, for the war lies with Serbia, though the Serbians wanted only a Balkan war, not a general European war. Second thing, a good deal of responsibility lies with Russia, because what the Germans did was a kind of calculated risk. The German leaders hoped that a war in the Balkans could be kept local, but they knew that if Russia intervened and came to Serbia's assistance, it was likely to escalate. But the German preference, this is a controversial point, but I think my take on this would be that most of the German leaders, particularly Wilhelm II, the Emperor, and Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg, their preference was to keep it down, localized in the Balkans. When Russia intervened, though, as the Germans knew there was a risk of that happening, then they were willing to stage a general European war rather than back down. So it's important that Russia intervenes. Russia mobilizes its armed forces, and that puts the Germans under tremendous pressure. The Russians intervened partly because they had had a sort of blank check from the French, their main ally. So the share of responsibility lies with the Russian and French as well as with the Germans. Final point, of course, is what about the British? And I think it's much more difficult to argue that the British have a major share of responsibility, though some historians have argued this. One view that's been put is that the British, and particularly their Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, should have given a warning much more emphatically that Britain would intervene if a European war took place. There are actually good constitutional reasons why Sir Edward Grey couldn't do this at an early stage in the crisis. So I think what we can argue with the British is perhaps there's a passive responsibility, but this is not the same as an active responsibility for actually sending out ultimatums and starting the war machines going. So coming back to sort of summary, I would still, in spite of the way in which the argument is now going, I think a number of other historians would still say primary responsibility lies with Germany and to an extent with Austria-Hungary, but responsibility is shared, and the French and Russians, and to an extent the Serbs, also have some share of responsibility for the outbreak of war in 1914. Ultimately, it's true that both sides prefer to fight rather than back down. It does take two sides to make a war.